The constant sound of hurried footsteps, muffled voices, and heart monitor alarms filled the air in the emergency ward of Central Hospital. For Dr. Emily Carter, every shift was a test of endurance. Her mind was accustomed to operating under pressure, making split-second decisions and handling lives in her hands. She hadn't known rest in months, but this exhaustion was something she embraced with purpose, saving lives, filling voids. It was a kind of anesthesia, a cure for a pain only she understood. Emily had just finished a complicated case when a nurse approached her with a new chart. "Dr. Carter, we have a new patient. It looks serious." Emily took the chart and glanced down at the name written in bold, slanted letters, Margaret Dawson. That name hit her like a stone. Her hands, usually so steady, felt a chill. Her face went pale, her eyes fixed on those letters. Margaret Dawson. It couldn't be. She hadn't heard that name, that cursed name, in decades. But there it was, on a patient file in her own ER. She looked up, trying to mask her shock, but the nurse noticed her discomfort. "Is everything okay, doctor?" the nurse asked, raising her eyebrows. Emily took a deep breath, straightening her posture. "Yes, I'll take care of it." The last thing she needed was anyone noticing any disturbance. She was prepared to face whatever came her way, or so she thought. As she walked toward the ward where Margaret was admitted, flashes of her childhood began to appear in her mind. She tried to push them away, but they surfaced with almost physical force. Emily, 6 years old, sitting on the steps of their building, watching her mother walk away without looking back. Teenage Emily, alone at school, watching other students with their parents, smiling and celebrating achievements she had always reached in silence. The hallways felt longer than ever. Each step brought her closer to that ghostly figure from her past. Standing at the door, she looked through the small glass window. There was her mother, Margaret, with the aged appearance and thin frame of someone who had long since left youth behind. Wrinkles lined the face she had once memorized as a child. Emily opened the door and entered the room, keeping her face expressionless. Margaret didn't look up. She seemed fragile, maybe even defeated. The sight stirred a mix of emotions in Emily: anger, pity, and a pang of something she didn't want to feel: compassion. "Good morning, Mrs. Dawson. How are you feeling?" Emily asked in a controlled, carefully professional tone. Every word was an effort to stay steady. Margaret turned toward her, not recognizing her. Her gaze was distant, weary. She shook her head slightly. "Not very well, but who cares, right?" she said with a sharp tone. She seemed almost unaccustomed to kindness, as if life had hardened every part of her. Emily felt a spark of fury in her chest. After everything, she was still this bitter, cold person, but she held back the anger, closing her eyes for a second before responding. "My job is to take care of you, ma'am, and I will do that." During the examination, Emily remained firm, allowing no trace of personal emotion, but her mother's name on the chart, her presence there, turned every movement into a challenge. Every professional word was a sacrifice to keep from blurting out an accusation, a question, a truth held back for years. When she finished checking her vitals and adjusting the medication dosage, Emily stood up to leave, but before she could take a step, she heard Margaret's voice. You look so young to be a doctor." Margaret seemed intrigued, maybe even a little impressed. Emily hesitated. The anger pulsed inside her, but she turned slowly and looked Margaret directly in the eyes. "Yes, I am young, but I work hard. I earned everything on my own," she replied with an almost cutting tone. Letting slip more than she intended, Margaret didn't grasp the provocation. Her gaze remained distant, as if she couldn't clearly see who was in front of her. "You must be strong then. Maybe stronger than I ever was." The words, spoken almost casually, hit Emily like a slap. "Yes, I am strong." "Because I had to be," she thought, but held back the reply. She turned and left the room quickly, without looking back. Outside the room, she leaned against the hallway wall, trying to regain control. What was she going to do now? Should she let someone else take over the case? Hand Margaret over to another doctor? But something stopped her. Maybe it was a kind of passive revenge, a desire to show this woman what she had become, to make her see the person she had abandoned. On the other hand, the weight of medical ethics and her own commitment to her patients pulled her in the other direction. It was an invisible battle between the professional and the wounded daughter that still existed inside her. Deep down, she knew she couldn't avoid this confrontation. Taking care of Margaret might be her greatest test, her real reckoning with the past. And so, without saying a word to anyone about the connection, Emily decided she would care for Margaret. She would use her white coat as armor, her calm as a barrier, and her skills as a doctor as a shield against everything this woman stirred within her. However, fate seemed to have other plans. Emily returned to the doctor's lounge, but her mind was elsewhere. She sat in a corner, rubbing her temples as she tried to calm the chaotic thoughts pounding in her head. The image of Margaret, fragile and aged, was etched in her mind, yet she couldn't associate it with the mother from her memories, the woman who had left her behind without a word. It was as if a door had opened, releasing a whirlwind of old memories she had kept locked away. Now they flooded Emily's mind like a storm she didn't know how to control. First, the memory that always haunted her, the night her mother simply vanished. Emily had been a child, only 6 years old, but the images were vivid in her mind. She remembered the sound of the door slamming and the emptiness that followed. She spent hours waiting for Margaret to come back, not understanding what was happening. When she realized she was truly alone, she sat on the building steps, clutching her teddy bear, the only comfort she had that dark night. The coldness of absence. That was how she described it to herself. That abandonment became the first of many traumas that shaped the person she would become. Alone, Emily learned early on that she couldn't rely on anyone, that the only person who would truly be there for her was herself. The following years were a series of rejections and challenges. She lived with distant relatives who accepted her out of obligation, but never offered the love or care a child should receive. She became the reserved girl, always in the back of family photos, the one no one noticed. But over time, Emily used this invisibility as a form of protection. If she didn't need anyone, no one could hurt her. Her teenage years were no kinder. While other girls her age celebrated important milestones with their families, Emily found herself alone. She remembered her high school graduation, where she was one of the few students without anyone there to applaud her. It was a special night for many, but for Emily, it was just another reminder that she was truly alone. She didn't shed a single tear that night. She was determined not to let the past define her future. Instead, she channeled all her energy and frustration into something that truly mattered to her, her studies. She decided she would become a doctor, achieve success, and prove to herself that her life had value, regardless of who had abandoned her. The next few years were tough, but Emily found a strength within herself she hadn't known she possessed. She worked double shifts, held multiple jobs to pay for college, studied late into the night, and ensured nothing would stand in the way of her dream. Every achievement was a small personal victory, a reminder that despite everything, she could reach her goals on her own. When she graduated from medical school, Emily looked at her diploma as a kind of trophy. She held it in her hands, thinking about how she had accomplished it all by herself. She wasn't just a doctor. She was someone who had defied the odds, left the scars of her past behind, and built a new identity for herself. But now, in that hospital, facing Margaret, she realized those scars were far from forgotten. She had tried to bury the past, but that unexpected encounter was bringing everything back to the surface. The strength she had built over the years was being tested by her mother's presence. She wondered if Margaret remembered her, if at any point her mother thought about the daughter she left behind. Could she have completely forgotten? The mere thought that her mother might feel no remorse left her with a bitter feeling, a deep anger Emily never knew she carried. That woman, now a patient under her care, was both a ghost and a living reminder of all the pain she had endured. And yet, Emily felt as though fate had placed Margaret there for a reason, as if somehow caring for her was the final challenge, the ultimate test for someone who had vowed never to depend on anyone again. With this thought, Emily stood up, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to face her next shift. She had a decision to make: to continue caring for Margaret, trying to balance her professional role with the pain of being a daughter, or to ask another doctor to take over the case. But deep down, she knew this was a personal battle, and that the confrontation with her past was already in motion. Emily didn't know yet what she would choose, but one thing was certain: this reunion was far from being just a coincidence. Emily returned to Margaret's room with her usual firm posture, her professional mask securely in place. She had already decided she would continue caring for her mother, but every step toward her felt like a test of emotional endurance. Each time she looked at Margaret's worn face, she felt the weight of a lifetime of abandonment and resentment, and the effort to maintain her composure grew more exhausting by the day. The days that followed were a true test of self-control for Emily. She came and went from Margaret's room several times a day, checking vitals, adjusting medications, keeping her voice calm and neutral, never letting any hint of anger or sadness show. On the outside, she was the picture of impeccable professionalism. On the inside, she was fighting a war. But Margaret seemed to sense something. At one point, after Emily adjusted her pillows, her mother observed her for a few seconds with an odd expression on her face. Margaret tilted her head, as if trying to decipher something in Emily, but quickly looked away, abandoning whatever thought had crossed her mind. Margaret, in a raspy voice, "You're very kind, doctor, even to a patient like me." The statement was both unexpected and irritating. Kind? Emily almost laughed at the irony. Kindness was the last thing she felt in the presence of this woman. She had to fight with every fiber of her being to hold back the emotions that surged like an avalanche each time she heard Margaret's voice. But instead of responding, Emily looked away and forced a slight smile, muttering something generic like, "It's my job." However, inside, her mind was screaming. She wanted to confront Margaret, to shout the truth she had kept hidden, to make this woman feel even a fraction of the suffering she had carried. Yet every time she thought about opening her mouth to speak, something held her back. It was as if she were trapped between the professional and the abandoned daughter, unsure of which one had more right to exist in that moment. The nights when she returned home were especially hard. In the silence of her empty apartment, Emily would sit and relive the traumas of the past. Every detail, every fragment of memory she had tried to bury, now invaded her thoughts with crushing intensity. She remembered how, as a child, she had longed for a hug, a kind word, a comforting presence. Instead, there was only darkness, loneliness, and the sound of her own muffled tears. "Why did you leave me?" The question echoed within her, resonating like a wound that had never healed. Emily silently asked it every time she entered Margaret's room. "Why did you choose to abandon me?" And there was an even more painful question. "Did you ever think of me?" In one of these tense silences, while changing Margaret's IV, she noticed her mother watching her with an expression that was hard to read, perhaps curiosity, perhaps something close to regret. Margaret seemed to want to say something, but quickly closed her mouth, letting the unspoken question linger in the air. This sense of stifled words, of unconfessed feelings, made the atmosphere in the room increasingly unbearable. It was as if they both carried a burden they didn't know how to release, a pain they inexplicably insisted on bearing alone. Emily's inner conflict only grew. At times, she questioned her own decision to keep treating Margaret. Perhaps it would be better to pass the case to another doctor, freeing herself from this emotional torment. But on the other hand, she felt that running away would be like admitting that the woman who abandoned her still had power over her, that she still controlled her in some way. It was an invisible but fierce battle. Each time Emily left Margaret's room, she felt drained, as if she had weathered an emotional storm no one else could see. Yet, with each passing day, she forced herself to keep going, partly out of pride, partly out of a need to prove she was stronger than her past. Finally, one night, after a long shift, Emily stopped in the hallway outside Margaret's room. She looked at the closed door, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of her own decision. She knew that by continuing with the case, she was reopening old wounds. And yet, something inside her resisted the idea of giving up. She knew she needed to see this through, to find out where it would lead her. Taking a deep breath, Emily straightened herself. Once again, she would face the confrontation with Margaret and with herself. Emily entered the room that night with a deeper exhaustion than usual. It wasn't just physical. It was an emotional fatigue that seemed to drain every last bit of energy she had left. Margaret lay there, pale and fragile, her gaze lost in a distant point. There was a sadness in those eyes that Emily didn't remember seeing before, a nearly palpable melancholy. As much as she tried to ignore it, it affected her in a way she couldn't dismiss. While adjusting the IV and checking vital signs, Margaret sighed and muttered something, almost as if speaking to the void. Margaret, almost to herself. Sometimes the weight of choices follows us our entire lives, doesn't it? Emily paused for a moment, hesitating. She didn't know how to respond, and honestly, she preferred not to start a conversation that might break down the emotional walls she'd been carefully maintaining. But before she could pull away, Margaret continued, her voice weak and raspy. "Margaret, do you believe in second chances, Doctor?" Emily avoided her mother's gaze but felt compelled to answer, "I believe some people fight to deserve them." The response seemed to encourage Margaret, who closed her eyes, releasing a trembling sigh. After a few seconds, she began to speak, as though Emily's presence was an excuse to unburden the regrets she had been carrying for years. "Margaret, there was a time when I was a mother, you know. I had a daughter, little, with bright eyes and a laugh that filled everything around her. But I left her." Emily felt her heart race. Hearing those words, spoken with such bitterness and guilt, brought a storm of emotions to the surface. She wanted to leave the room, wanted to stop Margaret, but something held her there, almost as if she needed to listen. "Margaret, I was a weak person, weak and selfish. I made terrible choices. Back then, I thought I was doing the best for us, but I was wrong. I abandoned my own daughter, Doctor. I left her alone." Margaret choked on her words, as if the pain of the past was still as raw as ever. Emily watched her closely, unable to look away. That unexpected confession caught her off guard, a mix of anger and surprise that left her speechless. She had never imagined Margaret carried any guilt. In fact, she believed her mother had moved on without ever looking back. Margaret, continuing with a broken voice, "I thought about her every day, you know, but I never had the courage to look for her. How could I, after everything I'd done? What right did I have to want to be in her life?" Emily closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Part of her still wanted to despise this woman, to shout that no excuse would ever be enough. But at the same time, seeing Margaret in such a state of vulnerability and sadness stirred something unexpected in her heart, a feeling that was dangerously close to compassion. "Margaret, do you think someone can be forgiven for something like that?" The question lingered in the air, and Emily felt as though Margaret had asked it directly to her. Though her mother didn't know the truth, how could she answer? What Margaret was asking was precisely what Emily had been denying herself, the chance to consider forgiveness. Finally, Emily murmured a response, trying to keep her tone neutral. "I think forgiveness depends on the person who was hurt and the willingness of the one who caused the pain to make things right." The words hung heavy in the air. Margaret remained silent, her eyes moist as she stared at the ceiling. For the first time, Emily saw that her mother wasn't just the villain in the story she had built in her mind. Margaret was a flawed woman who had made terrible choices, but who seemed shattered by the consequences of her actions. Emily left the room quietly, her heart in turmoil. Hearing Margaret's confession, she felt for the first time that her anger wasn't the only thing left between them. There was space for something else, a small but unsettling spark of doubt and perhaps compassion. But the question that haunted her now was she truly ready to confront what that might mean? The following days were filled with an invisible yet palpable tension every time Emily entered Margaret's room. Her mother's confession still echoed in her mind. The rigid image she'd held onto of a cruel, selfish, indifferent woman was beginning to crumble, leaving a troubling void in its place. Emily hated this feeling. She hated that she was beginning to feel empathy for someone who, in her view, didn't deserve forgiveness. And yet, something inside her urged her to confront that woman, to expose the truth, to finally tear off the mask. One night, after finishing her shift, Emily found herself standing at Margaret's door, filled with a newfound determination. She didn't know exactly what she would say or how the conversation would unfold, but she knew she could no longer avoid the inevitable. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. Margaret was awake, gazing out the window, her expression distant and her features tired. Hearing the footsteps, she turned to Emily with a look of surprise. "Margaret, doctor, is everything okay?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then slowly approached the bed, her eyes fixed on Margaret's. For the first time, she would not use her professional barriers as a shield. She would allow the daughter, not the doctor, to take control. "Emily, I need to tell you something you deserve to know." Margaret's face tightened in confusion. Her eyes searched Emily's face, trying to understand what was happening. But Emily held her gaze, unflinching. "Emily," her voice low but steady, "I am your daughter, Margaret. The little girl you left, that's me." The shock in Margaret's eyes was immediate. Her expression collapsed from disbelief to pure despair. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The revelation hit her like an unexpected blow, and all she could do was stare at Emily as if seeing a ghost. Margaret, stammering, her voice broken, "Emily, no, it can't be." "Emily, yes, Margaret, it's me, the child you left alone, the one you never came back for. And now look, I'm the one taking care of you." The intensity in Emily's words was piercing. She didn't know exactly what she wanted from this revelation, but she felt a strange relief in finally confronting her mother, in exposing the pain she had carried all these years. It was as if, in that moment, all the hurt and resentment found an escape. Margaret began to tremble, tears streaming down her face. She tried to speak, but her words were choked by sobs. I didn't know. I never imagined that. God, forgive me." Emily kept her gaze steady, without any apparent compassion. "Forgive you, Margaret? Do you know what it's like to live for years wondering why you weren't enough for your own mother to stay? Do you know what it feels like to be abandoned? To feel insignificant?" Margaret covered her face with her hands, her sobs filling the silence of the room. She had no words. The woman who was once young and full of dreams was now broken, regretful, but powerless to undo the past. "Margaret, Emily, I was a terrible mother. I made mistakes I can't even understand myself. I know what I did is unforgivable, but please, let me try to make it right, even if it's too late." Emily felt her heart racing. For years, she had fantasized about this moment, about unleashing all her pain on Margaret. But now, standing face to face with her mother, something unexpected was happening. The confrontation, instead of bringing the relief she'd imagined, seemed to open even more wounds. "Emily, make it right? You can't fix what's already been destroyed, Margaret. I am the living proof of what you caused." Margaret tried to reach out to Emily, but she instinctively pulled away, retreating from her touch. Margaret lowered her hand, resigned, her eyes filled with tears, her face marked by despair. "Margaret, I just wanted a chance to know you, to ask for your forgiveness." Emily didn't respond immediately. Her breathing was heavy, her heart confused, somewhere buried under layers of anger. She felt a hint of something she couldn't identify. Was it compassion, doubt, or perhaps a deep exhaustion from carrying that weight? She merely murmured, almost to herself, "Forgiveness isn't something you ask for, Margaret. It's something you earn." She turned and left the room without looking back, leaving Margaret alone in her tears and regret. The revelation had been devastating for both of them, but Emily still didn't know what to do with it all. That night, Emily left the hospital with her mind in turmoil. The revelation had been a shock not only for Margaret, but also for herself. For years, she had fed her anger, shaping her identity around a story of abandonment and pain. To her, Margaret had been a distant, almost unreal figure, like a ghost from the past. But now, seeing the fragile, broken woman asking for forgiveness had planted a seed of doubt in her heart. Was forgiveness possible? She wondered this as she walked through the city streets, trying to calm the storm raging inside her. She had never seriously considered this possibility. In her mind, forgiveness was an empty word, something reserved for people who deserved a second chance. And Margaret, in Emily's view, had never earned that. Yet the image of her mother, crumbling in tears, continued to haunt her. When she got home, Emily sat on the couch, staring into the void. She remembered Margaret's words, the way she had described the weight of her choices, and for the first time began to see her mother in a new light. Margaret wasn't just the villain of her story. She was a person with flaws, regrets, and a pain that might be deeper than Emily had ever imagined. What to do with this realization, however, was still a difficult question to answer. The following morning, returning to the hospital, Emily hesitated as she approached Margaret's room. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to face the woman who, despite everything, was still her mother. Finally, gathering her courage, she entered the room in silence. Margaret was lying down, her gaze lost on the ceiling, as if immersed in her own world. Seeing Emily, she sat up slightly, surprised. There was a shadow of fear and regret in her eyes, but also a quiet hope. "Margaret," in a soft voice, almost a plea, "Emily, you came back." Emily remained silent, observing her. Until that moment, she hadn't realized just how aged her mother looked, how time and the weight of choices had marked her face. Slowly she approached, feeling her heart race, and finally sat beside her, holding Margaret's gaze. "Emily, I spent years wondering if you ever thought of me, if you ever regretted it." Margaret closed her eyes, tears running softly down her face. "Emily, my daughter, I thought of you every day. I was afraid to look for you, to face what I had done, to see what I had destroyed. But even with all this regret, I know that what I did is unforgivable." Emily felt a tightness in her chest. Her mother's confession touched her in a way she didn't want to admit, because it threatened to dismantle the anger she had carefully cultivated for years. "Emily, I don't know if I can forgive Margaret. I don't know if it's fair to give you a second chance." "Margaret, I understand. Just knowing that you're here, that you gave me the chance to see you and explain, is more than I ever expected. I'm so sorry. From the bottom of my heart, I'm sorry." Silence filled the space between them. Emily lowered her head, feeling a mix of pain and compassion. The decision she had to make wasn't easy. Forgiveness wasn't something granted overnight, but something inside her began to shift in that moment. "Emily, I don't know if I can forget what happened, but maybe I can one day understand." Margaret nodded, her gaze filled with profound gratitude. There were no more words to be said. Both knew that forgiveness would be a long process and that there were still wounds to heal. But in that moment, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: relief. As she left the room, a sense of peace began to settle over her. She realized that by opening herself to forgiveness, she was also freeing herself from a burden she had carried for far too long. It wasn't a complete forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. In the days that followed, Emily and Margaret began a sort of silent ritual, a slow and cautious process of drawing closer. They didn't speak openly about the past, but gradually they shared details they had never imagined exchanging. Small gestures became the first steps toward a connection that once seemed impossible. One morning, while checking Margaret's vitals, Emily noticed her mother gazing out a corner window, captivated by the leaves moving outside. There was a calm expression on her face, as if she were lost in distant memories. Emily, trying to ease the silence. "I used to love windows as a child. I'd spend time there, imagining a different world." Margaret turned to her, surprised by her daughter's spontaneity. "It's something we have in common then. When I was young, I spent hours looking out the window, thinking about what might have been." This small, unassuming exchange opened a door. From that moment, Emily felt more comfortable sharing parts of her life with Margaret, and her mother, in turn, did the same. It was strange, almost surreal, being there as mother and daughter, exchanging words with an emotional weight that neither fully acknowledged. One day, Margaret hesitantly spoke about the difficult time she went through before abandoning Emily. She shared the financial struggles, emotional turmoil, and how unprepared she felt to be a good mother. "It wasn't just weakness, Emily, it was fear, a fear that consumed me, and I didn't know how to face it." Emily listened, her eyes fixed on her mother, trying to absorb this new perspective. Every word seemed to soften the layers of resentment, transforming them into a painful curiosity. She didn't forgive the abandonment, but she was beginning to understand the vulnerability of the woman before her, something she'd never imagined existed. In return, Emily told Margaret about her own youth, the hardships she endured, being raised by relatives who never showed genuine affection. She shared how she had always felt that something was missing, how she had learned to close her heart to avoid more pain. "I had to be strong because there was no one else to be strong for me," she said, not as an accusation, but as a simple statement. Each day, small gestures demonstrated their mutual attempts to connect. Emily would bring Margaret a cup of coffee or stay a few extra minutes after her shift, answering simple but important questions about her life. Margaret, in turn, showed genuine gratitude, holding Emily's hand a little longer when she approached, her eyes misty. One afternoon, Margaret made a request that, to her, was almost like an apology. "Emily, may I tell you a story? A story you may have heard before, but in a different way." Emily hesitated but nodded, sitting beside her mother. Margaret began to speak of a time when she was young, hopeful, and full of dreams. She talked about how she fell in love, how she believed she would build a perfect life, but how the weight of expectations and hardships eventually overwhelmed her. Listening to this story, Emily began to see Margaret not just as a mother who had failed, but as a woman who, like so many others, had lost her way. These moments didn't erase the pain of the past, but they placed new layers over it, as if a new relationship were being carefully built over old ruins. Emily felt she couldn't yet forget what she had endured, but she was also allowing herself to see that the woman before her was no longer the same. One night, as she was saying goodbye to Margaret, Emily felt a sudden urge to say something she hadn't yet expressed. She looked at her mother, her eyes conveying a quiet seriousness. "Emily, I don't know what our relationship will be like from here, Margaret. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget everything that happened, but I want you to know, today, I feel less anger." Margaret smiled, moved, holding Emily's hand. That is more than I could ever ask for, my daughter." Those days in the hospital became a new chapter in their lives, a shared space where each conversation, each look, each gesture was an attempt at rebuilding. The process was slow and fragile, but for the first time, both were willing to try. The days at the hospital passed slowly, but for Emily, each one brought a sense of closure. Over time, the weight she carried in her chest felt lighter, and the anger that had consumed her for years was giving way to an unexpected calm. The past was still there, but it now felt more distant, like an echo that no longer affected her in the same way. One morning, as she finished her shift, Emily decided to stop by Margaret's room one last time. Entering, she found her mother sitting silently, her gaze serene, almost peaceful. They looked at each other, and for a moment, no words were needed. The connection between them, once thought impossible, now existed subtly, built through small gestures and a mutual acceptance. Margaret, Emily, I don't know what the future holds for us, but thank you for giving me a chance, for letting me be part of your life, even if only now. Emily nodded, feeling a mix of emotions. She looked at Margaret, the woman who, for so long, had been only a painful memory, and now was a real, flawed, human figure. She knew the wounds would never completely disappear, but she also knew she had found something more precious than she had expected, a kind of inner peace. Emily, I don't know if forgiveness is something we give to others or to ourselves, but I know that I feel different, lighter. She moved closer to Margaret, holding her hand firmly, a gesture that held not only pain and loss, but also understanding and acceptance. It symbolized a new phase, where the past still existed but no longer defined who she was. Leaving the hospital that day, Emily felt as though she was closing an important chapter of her life. She realized that by forgiving Margaret, she had freed herself from a weight she'd carried for far too long. Forgiveness didn't change the past, but it allowed her to move forward without the chains that had bound her to suffering. She understood that forgiveness, although difficult, was an act of liberation, a choice she had made for herself. Her story with Margaret was now a part of who she was, but it was no longer the center of her life. She would move on, lighter and stronger, knowing that the path to peace began within herself.